The splintered wood of the wagon bed bit into Alara's cheek, a cruel lattice of cold and pain. Every jolt of the iron-rimmed wheels sent a tremor through her bones, a fresh reminder of the unforgiving miles that separated her from a life she had torched in a single, desperate act. Darkness was absolute beneath the heavy canvas tarp, a smothering blanket that tasted of dust and dry rot. Fear, a living thing with icy claws, had long since burrowed deep into her marrow, leaving her shivering with a chill that had nothing to do with the biting wind that sliced through the gaps in the fabric. She was a ghost hiding in a rattling coffin, praying the driver would not look back. He had loaded sacks of grain and flour in redemption, the town she had fled, his face shadowed by the brim of a worn hat, his movements economical and silent. He was a spectre himself, a man spoken of in whispers, the one they called Silas. The one who lived where the law's long arm grew tired and fell short. Her only hope. The wagon lurched to a final, jarring halt. The sudden stillness was more terrifying than the motion. She heard the creak of leather, the soft thud of boots on hard-packed earth, the low nicker of a horse being unhitched. Each sound was a hammer blow against the fragile shell of her concealment. He would find her. He would find the stolen bread in her satchel, the worn blanket clutched in her fist. He would see the brand of a runaway, a pariah, and cast her back into the wilderness or, worse, drag her back to town to face Judge Barrows, her guardian, the man whose claim she had refused. Her breath hitched, a tiny, traitorous sound in the sudden quiet. She fumbled in her satchel, her frozen fingers closing around the cold, smooth glass of the lantern. It was her only currency, the only thing of value she owned besides her own life. With trembling hands, she struck a match. The flare was blinding, the sulphurous sent a sharp perfume in the stale air. The wick caught, casting a small, wavering pool of gold. The light gave her a courage she did not possess, a single point of warmth in a universe of cold. The canvas flap was thrown back. A silhouette, broad and immense, blotted out the star-dusted sky. The wind howled behind him, a hungry animal. Alara pushed herself up, her joints screaming in protest. She held the lantern high, its light catching the hard planes of his face, the suspicion in his dark, unreadable eyes. He did not speak, simply stared, his expression a mask of stone carved by wind and solitude. He was older than she'd imagined, his hair streaked with gray at the temples, his face a map of hardships she could only guess at. A tremor ran through her arm, but she held the lantern steady, a desperate beacon. Her voice, when it came, was a raw whisper, scraped from the depths of her throat. "I knew you were him." He said nothing for a long moment, the silence stretching until it became a physical weight. The lantern flame trembled, casting dancing shadows that made his face seem both savage and weary. He looked from her pale, determined face to the small lantern, then back again. His gaze missed nothing, the fine wool of her dress, now torn and soiled, the terror that swam in her wide eyes, the raw resolve that kept her from collapsing. He had seen desperation before, it was the common language of the plains. But this was different. This was a fragile bird that had somehow flown into the heart of a blizzard and, against all odds, had not yet fallen. He finally moved, stepping aside, his gesture curt. Out, his voice was low and gravelly, like stones grinding together. It was not a welcome, but a command. Alara scrambled from the wagon, her legs weak and clumsy. When her feet touched the ground, she nearly buckled, but caught herself, her pride a thin, brittle reed. She stood before him, small and shivering in the vast, open emptiness of his homestead. It was not a farm, but a fortress against the wilderness, a squat cabin of thick, dark logs, a sturdy lean-to for the horses, and a single, skeletal cottonwood clawing at the ink-black sky. The wind was a physical force here, trying to strip the very flesh from her bones. He took the lantern from her hand. His fingers brushed against hers, calloused and surprisingly warm. The brief contact sent a shock through her, a flicker of heat in the overwhelming cold. He led the way to the cabin without a word. The inside was as stark as the out. A stone hearth dominated one wall, its embers glowing a dull, angry red. A rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a bed built into the far wall. Everything was scrubbed clean, meticulously ordered, the armory of a man who waged a daily war against chaos. He motioned for her to sit at the table, then moved to the hearth, adding logs from a neat stack. Flames leaped up, hungry and bright, and with them came a wave of life-giving warmth. Elara watched him, her fear slowly being replaced by a profound sense of dislocation. She had thrown herself upon the mercy of a complete stranger, a man whose reputation was built on silence and a capacity for violence. She had expected a monster, perhaps. Instead, she found only a man, weathered and solitary, whose every movement spoke of a deep, unyielding competence. He poured water into a tin pot and set it over the fire, then turned to face her, leaning against the stone of the hearth. The firelight played across his features, softening the harsh lines. "Judge Barrows," he stated. It wasn't a question. Elara flinched as if struck. She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. The name itself was a brand, a claim of ownership she had fought to escape. "He'll come looking," Silas said, his voice flat. "Men like him don't take kindly to losing property." The word property hung in the air, ugly and sharp. She finally found her voice, though it was thin and reedy. "I am not his property." Silas's eyes held hers. For the first time, she saw something flicker in their depths, not pity, but a kind of weary understanding. "Doesn't matter what you are. Matters what he thinks you are." He pushed away from the hearth and retrieved a tin cup, filling it with steaming water. He placed it on the table in front of her. "You can stay the night. The storm will be on us by morning. After that, you move on." It was a dismissal, a temporary stay of execution. Yet, it was more than she'd had an hour ago. She wrapped her frozen hands around the hot cup, the warmth seeping into her skin. She was alive. She was inside. For one night, she was safe from the wind and the dark. And as the rising storm began to shriek around the sturdy cabin walls, that small, grudging mercy felt as vast and as vital as the open sky. The storm broke before dawn, a fury of wind and sleet that hammered against the cabin, turning the world outside into a formless, roaring void. It was a prison and a sanctuary all at once. For 2 days, they were sealed inside, the howling of the wind a constant, oppressive third presence in the room. The silence between them was a different entity altogether, not empty, but filled with the weight of things unsaid. Elara woke the first morning on the pallet of blankets he had laid for her by the hearth, the fire banked but still radiating a gentle warmth. Silas was already awake, cleaning a rifle with methodical, practiced motions. He did not acknowledge her stirring, yet she felt his awareness of her in the rigid set of his shoulders. She refused to be a helpless burden. Rising quietly, she took the small store of flour and dried apples she'd seen in his pantry and, with a little water, began to make a crude flatbread. Her movements were hesitant at first, unsure of her place in this starkly masculine space, but the familiar rhythm of kneading the dough was a comfort, an anchor in the uncertainty. He watched her from the corner of his eye, his hands never ceasing their work. He saw the efficiency in her movements, the way she wasted nothing. She did not chatter or weep or demand. She simply existed, a quiet, resilient presence that slowly, imperceptibly, began to alter the cabin's austere atmosphere. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the relentless assault of the storm. The bread was plain, but it was hot, and it was something she had made. A small offering. A quiet declaration that she was more than just a refugee. Later, she found his mending kit, a simple collection of thick needles and waxed thread, and set to work repairing a tear in one of his canvas saddlebags. The work was meticulous, requiring focus. It allowed her to observe him without being obvious. She watched him oil his leather harnesses, his hands large yet deft. She saw the way he moved, with an economy born of a life stripped down to its essentials. There was no wasted energy, no superfluous gesture. He was a part of the harsh landscape, shaped by it, as enduring and unadorned as the rock and timber of his home. He was a man who knew how to survive. She began to see that his silence was not emptiness, but a deep reservoir of thought. His solitude was not loneliness, but a deliberate choice. He had built this life for himself, a bulwark against a world he clearly wanted no part of. Her intrusion was a crack in that wall, and she did not know if he meant to repair it by casting her out or by fortifying it around her. On the second day, the storm's fury lessened slightly, but travel was still impossible. He spent the afternoon sharpening an axe, the rhythmic scrape of stone against steel filling the cabin. Elara, having run out of mending, simply sat by the fire, watching the flames. "He promised me to a business partner," she said suddenly, the words rushing out before she could stop them. "A man 3 times my age, with cruel hands and a wet mouth." For a parcel of land, Silas did not stop his work, but the rhythm faltered for a fraction of a second. That was his only reply. She took it as permission to continue, the story pouring out of her like water from a broken dam. She spoke of her parents' death, of being left to the guardianship of Judge Barrows, a man who saw her only as an asset on a ledger. She spoke of the town's feigned piety, the sideways glances, the women who pitied her and the men who coveted her. She spoke not with self-pity, but with a cold, clear anger that had been simmering for years. When she finished, the only sound was the shush of the sharpening stone and the dying wind outside. She felt hollowed out, exposed. She had laid the truth of her life on his table like a sacrificial offering. He finished his work, tested the blade with his thumb, and set the axe aside. He walked to the fire and added another log, his back to her. "Land," he said, his voice rough. "Men will trade their souls for it." He turned, and his eyes met hers across the small room. The suspicion was gone, replaced by something she could not name. It was not softness. It was recognition. He had seen this story before, in different forms. The greed of powerful men, the crushing of the weak. It was the very thing he had built this life to escape. He did not offer words of comfort. He did not have any. Instead, he simply nodded, a short, sharp gesture of acknowledgement. In the profound quiet of the cabin, with the storm finally breathing its last, that single nod felt like a vow. The morning of the third day dawned cold and brilliantly clear. The world was scoured clean, washed in the pale light of a winter sun. The air was still. Too still. The peace felt fragile, temporary. As Silas hitched his horse to the wagon for a trip to check his trap lines, a task delayed by the storm, Elara felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. The end of the storm meant the roads were open. It meant she could leave. It meant Barrows could arrive. She stood in the cabin doorway, watching him. "I can work," she said, her voice stronger now. "I can cook, I can mend. I can learn to do more." He paused, his hand on the horse's flank, and looked at her. He saw not the terrified girl who had tumbled from his wagon, but a woman standing straight, her chin held high, making a proposition, not a plea. "This is no place for you," he said, his tone flat, unarguable. It was a statement of fact, not a dismissal. The land was hard, the winters brutal, the solitude a crushing weight for most. Before she could form a reply, his head snapped up. His entire body went rigid, his gaze fixed on the low ridge to the east. Elara followed his line of sight. At first, she saw nothing but the stark line of snow and sky. Then, they appeared. 3 riders, black specks against the white, moving with an unhurried, arrogant purpose. The knot in her stomach turned to ice. It was them. It was Barrows. Silas moved without haste, but with a chilling efficiency. "Inside," he said, his voice a low command. "Bar the door. Stay away from the window." He did not reach for the rifle propped by the door. Instead, he simply stood by the wagon, waiting, a solitary figure of immense stillness. He was not a man preparing for a fight, he was a man who was the fight. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she did as he commanded, her hands fumbling with the heavy wooden bar. She pressed herself against the wall beside the single small window, peering through a crack in the logs. She could see Barrows clearly now, his portly figure bundled in a fine wool coat, his face red with cold and indignation. The two men with him were hired guns, their faces hard and mean, their hands resting near the pistols on their hips. They reined in a few yards from Silas, a calculated distance of intimidation. "Silas," Barrows called out, his voice carrying in the crisp air, slick with false bonhomie. "We've no quarrel with you. We're just here for my ward. The girl you have harbored." Silas remained silent, his arms crossed over his chest. His stillness was his weapon, an unnerving, absolute calm that seemed to suck the confidence from the air. "She is a thief and a runaway," Barrows blustered, his voice growing louder. "Under my legal protection. You will turn her over now." "She's not here," Silas said, his voice level, carrying easily. It was a lie so blatant, so devoid of guile, that it was a direct insult. Barrows' face purpled. "Do not play games with me, man. We saw the smoke from your chimney. We know she's in there. Send her out, or we'll burn you out." One of the hired guns shifted his weight, his hand dropping to the butt of his pistol. From her vantage point, Elara saw Silas's gaze flicker to the man, a look so cold and final it was as if he were measuring him for a coffin. Then he looked back at Barrows. "You're on my land," he said softly, yet every word was a stone. "Your laws, your claims, they don't reach this far. Turn your horses around, damn you." Barrows spat, his composure finally shattering. "She is mine." And in that moment, something inside Elara broke. Not in fear, but in fury. She would not be a prize to be fought over. She would not hide behind this man while her fate was decided. With trembling hands, she lifted the heavy bar, pulled the door open, and stepped out into the blinding sunlight. She stood on the porch, blinking against the glare, her slight frame silhouetted against the dark wood of the cabin. She did not look at Barrows. She looked only at Silas, her silent ally, her unwilling protector. She would stand with him. Barrows's jaw dropped. Seeing her there, defiant and free, seemed to enrage him more than Silas's quiet resistance. A malevolent triumph lit his eyes. "There you are, you ungrateful wretch. You see, Silas. The property presents itself. Now step aside." Silas did not step aside. He did not even look at her. His entire focus remained on the three men, a predator assessing a threat. He had not wanted her to reveal herself, had not wanted to escalate this, but now that she had, his resolve hardened into granite. He had offered her shelter from the storm, and these men were the storm made flesh. His protection, once grudging, was now absolute. Elara felt a strange calm settle over her. The terror that had been her constant companion for days was gone, burned away by the cold fire of her resolve. She had run as far as she could. This was the place she would make her stand. "I am not your property, Judge," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying across the snow-dusted yard. "I am not a parcel of land to be traded. I will not be going with you." Barrows let out a short, ugly laugh. "You have no choice in the matter. You are a child, and you are my ward." He turned his venom on Silas. "And you hermit. You'll hang for this. For kidnapping. For theft." The second hired gun, emboldened by his employer, began to slowly draw his pistol. Silas's movement was a blur. It was not fast, but it was impossibly fluid, a motion of pure economy. He took 2 steps to his left, closing the angle, and the hunting knife he carried at the small of his back was suddenly in his hand, its blade catching the winter sun. He did not raise it. He simply held it, the point angled slightly downward. It was not a threat, it was a promise. "The last man who drew a gun on me is buried on that hill," Silas said, his voice still quiet, yet it cut through the air like the edge of his blade. He thought his friend would be fast enough to help him. He was wrong. He looked from one hired gun to the other. "There are 2 of you. But I only need to be faster than the first 1 inch. The silence that followed was absolute. The hired guns froze, their bravado evaporating in the face of such cold, mathematical certainty. They were here for coin, not to die in the snow over a girl for a pompous old man. They exchanged a look. Barrows saw the shift, the sudden wilting of his paid muscle. Panic flickered across his face. "You can't, the law, there is only one law here," Silas interrupted, his voice dropping even lower. "And I am its judge. Leave." Now, he took a single, deliberate step forward. It was enough. The first hired gun raised his hands slightly, a gesture of concession, and began to back his horse away. The second quickly followed suit. Barrows, sputtering with impotent rage, was left alone, his authority stripped bare, revealed as nothing more than a costume he wore in town. He stared at Alara, his eyes promising retribution he could no longer deliver, then wheeled his horse around and galloped after his men, a defeated tyrant fleeing back to his shrunken kingdom. Alara watched them disappear over the ridge, the silence they left behind ringing in her ears. The tension drained out of her, leaving her weak-kneed, but she remained standing. Silas sheathed his knife, the motion as smooth and final as the one that had drawn it. He turned and his eyes finally met hers. The space between them felt charged, altered. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not a burden or a victim, but the woman who had opened the door and chosen to stand. He walked to the cabin and picked up the rifle he had left by the door. He held it out to her, but first. "The storm is over," he said. "But winter is long. You'll need to learn how to use this." Alara looked from his weathered face to the heavy rifle, its wood worn smooth from his hands. It was not an apology, not a declaration. It was a statement of fact. It was an offer of partnership. It was the beginning of a new life. She reached out and took it, the weight of the steel and wood solid and real in her grasp. The cabin behind her was no longer a temporary shelter but a home. The vast, empty wilderness stretching before her was no longer a threat, but a sanctuary.